I have always believed that the measure of a woman's strength is not in how loudly she speaks, but in how steadily she endures. My life was proof of that. From the moment I held my son in my arms, I promised him two things: that I would love him without conditions, and that I would build a world strong enough for him to stand upon, even if it cost me everything. I was not born into wealth, nor did life ever hand me an easy path. Every dollar I earned was bent and stretched until it could feed us both. I worked long hours, taking jobs others looked down on, because pride meant nothing if my boy went hungry. And yet, even in those long nights when exhaustion wrapped itself around my bones, I found joy. For the smile on his small face, for the laughter that filled our tiny home, for the way he looked at me as though I could move mountains just by holding his hand, that was worth every sacrifice. I remember the winters most clearly. The house was old, the heater unreliable, and sometimes I could see my breath in the morning air. I used to tuck him into bed with extra blankets, whispering stories of heroes and mothers who fought through storms. He would fall asleep, warm against my side, believing I was the strongest woman in the world. And I believed it too. At least, back then. Raising him was never a burden to me. It was a calling, a purpose. When he stumbled, I lifted him. When he succeeded, I clapped louder than anyone else. When life was cruel, I reminded him that storms pass, but character remains. And in my heart, I always thought, when I am old, when my hands no longer have the strength to work, this son will be my comfort, my companion, my proof that love returns when you give it freely. But love does not always return. Sometimes it twists, sometimes it vanishes, and sometimes it sharpens into a blade that cuts deeper than any stranger's wound. Still, in those early years, I never doubted. I built our days with care. I cooked meals from scratch, stretched leftovers into feasts, and celebrated every birthday with a cake baked from love, even if it leaned awkwardly in the oven. I saved pennies for his schooling, worked weekends so he could join sports teams, and mended his clothes by hand so he would never feel less than the other children. And oh, how proud I was when he graduated. I sat in the crowd with tears spilling down my face, clapping so hard my hands stung. He was my greatest work, my finest story. I thought to myself, this is what all the sleepless nights were for. This is why I endured. Back then, I never imagined that the same boy who once reached for my hand with innocent trust would one day turn his back. I never thought the home I built for him would one day feel like a battlefield where I was the enemy. But betrayal does not strike all at once. No, it comes softly, like the shadow of a storm far on the horizon. You don't notice it at first. You only feel a shift in the air, a coolness where warmth once lived. And before you realize it, the skies above you have darkened. Looking back, I see the signs, the small dismissals, the way his eyes sometimes shifted away when I spoke, the hurried excuses when I wanted more time together. At the time, I told myself it was life, that young men grow busy, that independence makes them pull away. I never wanted to cling, never wanted to burden. I thought giving him space was another form of love. But love without respect is fragile. Love without gratitude is dangerous. And I was about to learn that lesson in the cruelest way. Even now, as I sit here with years heavy upon my shoulders, I can still hear the sound of his laughter as a child. It was pure, ringing through our modest home like music. I hold on to that memory because it reminds me of who he once was, before the world, or perhaps someone else, reshaped him into a man I barely recognized. If you are listening to my story, I ask you to stay with me until the end, for it is not only a tale of pain, but of strength, of how a woman betrayed can rise again. Too many of us have felt the sting of being forgotten by those we sacrificed everything for. Too many of us have sat in silence, wondering if our worth has an expiration date once our children no longer need us. But I promise you this, my story does not end in silence. My voice may tremble, but it does not break. My heart may bleed, but it does not stop beating. And though betrayal has cut me, it has also carved me into something unshakable. Because in the end, betrayal is not just about what they did to me. It is about what I chose to do after. And that is where my revenge begins. There is a saying I often repeated to myself in those years: a mother's love is the only wealth that cannot be stolen. I clung to that thought, because so much of my life had been about giving, not keeping. I gave my son everything, my time, my health, my youth, poured into the vessel of his future. I told myself it was enough, that one day he would see it, that one day he would turn back to me with gratitude shining in his eyes. And perhaps, for a brief season, I believed that day had arrived. When he first brought his wife home, I remember my heart swelling with pride. She was lovely, graceful in her own way, and I thought, at last, my son has chosen a partner to walk beside him. At last, I can rest a little, knowing he will not be alone. I welcomed her as though she were my own daughter. I cooked her favorite meals, asked her about her childhood, offered the kind of advice that only years of hardship can shape. I wanted her to feel the warmth of a family, to know that I would stand beside her as surely as I had stood beside my son. But sometimes, the masks people wear are sewn so tightly that you do not see the cracks until it is too late. At first, the changes were small. She preferred her own recipes to mine. That was natural. She wanted her own style of home, her own rhythm. I told myself to step aside, to let her claim her space. Then came the silences, polite but cool. She smiled, but her eyes did not. Her words were soft, but edged like glass. And little by little, I felt myself being shifted to the side, as though I were an old piece of furniture, valuable once, but now inconvenient. My son, blinded by love, did not notice. Or perhaps he noticed, and chose not to see. That was the beginning of the storm, not with shouting, not with cruelty, but with the slow erosion of closeness. Where once he came to me for every decision, every worry, now he leaned toward her. Where once my voice carried weight, now it seemed like an echo, fading before it reached his ears. I told myself not to be jealous, not to cling. He was her husband now, and that bond was sacred. But there is a difference between sharing love and replacing it. There is a difference between being part of a family and being erased from it. And slowly, I felt the erasure begin. I would hear them whispering in the evenings, doors closing just as I approached. I noticed the sudden quiet when I entered the room, the way she looked at me, not with respect, not with warmth, but with calculation, as though she was measuring how long it would take to push me completely out. Still, I smiled. Still, I cooked meals, folded laundry, cared for the home. Still, I tried to remind my son of the bond we had built. I told myself that love was stronger than manipulation, that truth would outlast deceit. But there was one night I will never forget. One night when the shadow of betrayal brushed against me for the first time, and I realized that my place in my son's heart was no longer secure. It was late. I had gone to bed early, weary from the day, but the murmur of voices carried through the thin walls. I heard my name, not with affection, not with kindness, but as though I were an obstacle. "She's always here," she whispered. "We'll never have our own life as long as she's in the way." And then, the words that pierced deeper than any knife. "She's old. She's lived her life. It's our time now." Silence followed, and then, my son's voice, low, uncertain, but not in my defense, not standing for me, not protecting me, only silence, and then a sigh. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside me shift. For the first time in all my years of sacrifice, I understood that love can be blind, and blindness can be dangerous. Still, I said nothing. Still, I rose the next morning and cooked breakfast, my hands steady though my heart trembled. Still, I kissed my son's cheek and asked about his work, pretending not to notice the way his wife's lips curved in a smile that never touched her eyes. You see, betrayal does not arrive as thunder. It creeps in like fog, and before you know it, you cannot see the path you once walked with certainty. But hear me when I say this. Betrayal may blind you for a time, but it cannot extinguish the fire of a strong woman forever. If you have ever felt the sting of being unwanted in your own family, of being made to feel like a guest in the home you built, then you understand my pain. And you must also understand this. The story does not end in pain, not mine, not yours. For every scar, there is a lesson. For every betrayal, there is a strength waiting to be born. And though the shadows around me were thickening, I would not remain lost in them forever. The day was coming when I would reclaim what was mine. The day was coming when my silence would end, and when that day arrived, my son and his wife would learn a truth they had long forgotten. A mother's love is deep, but so is her strength, and a woman betrayed is a woman reborn. Asterisk. In those days, I often caught myself standing at the window, watching the world outside move on without me. Neighbors laughed on their porches, families strolled hand in hand, and I felt a strange kind of loneliness creep into my chest. Not the loneliness of being alone. I had endured that many years. No, this was the loneliness of being invisible while surrounded by people you love. I would ask myself questions that kept me awake at night. Where did I go wrong? Did I give too much? Did I raise a son who does not remember the sacrifices that shaped him? Or did love blind me so much that I ignored the truth standing in front of me? A mother's heart does not easily accept betrayal. It tries to excuse it, explain it, even forgive it before the wound is fully revealed. That was me then, searching for reasons, trying to soften the blow, telling myself that time would heal the distance growing between us. But the truth is, time does not heal betrayal. It sharpens it. It turns small cuts into deep scars. One afternoon, I decided to bake the cake my son loved since childhood. Chocolate with thick frosting, the kind I used to surprise him with after long school days. I thought, perhaps this will bring back memories. Perhaps this will remind him of who we are. I worked carefully, measuring each ingredient, humming the lullabies I once sang to him as a boy. When the cake was finished, I set it on the table, the scent filling the air like a memory made tangible. My heart lifted when I heard the front door open. My son walked in, his wife beside him, her hand curled possessively around his arm. "Look," I said softly, "I made your favorite." But instead of the smile I longed for, instead of the spark of recognition, he glanced at his wife before answering, and her laugh, sharp, dismissive, cut through the air. "He doesn't even like that anymore," she said. "We prefer lighter desserts. Not this old-fashioned kind of thing." My son's eyes flickered with hesitation, but he said nothing. He sat at the table, pushed the cake aside, and spoke of work, of plans, of anything but me. I sat there, my hands folded, the sweetness of the cake turning bitter in my mouth. It wasn't about the dessert. It was about the dismissal, about the way years of love could be brushed aside in a single moment, as though they no longer mattered. That night, I did not cry. Instead, I felt something inside me harden. A line was being drawn, one I had avoided seeing for too long. I realized then that my fight would not be to keep my place in his heart. That battle was already lost. My fight would be for myself, for my dignity, for the truth of who I was and what I had given. Because here is the truth: few dare to speak when you give everything. There are those who will take it as weakness. They will mistake your silence for surrender, your kindness for blindness, and when they do, they will push until you stand on the edge of yourself. I was on that edge, but I would not fall. Instead, I would rise. I began to watch more closely, to listen more carefully. I noticed the way her words always carried a hidden barb. I noticed the way my son's choices were no longer his own. And slowly, I began to see the shape of the betrayal forming, though it had not yet revealed itself fully. Do you know what it feels like to see a storm coming, knowing you cannot stop it, only brace for its impact? That is how I lived. Every smile from her felt like a lie. Every silence from him felt like an absence where love once lived. But if they thought I would remain blind forever, they were wrong. If they thought I would simply fade into the background, forgotten and discarded, they underestimated me. Because my story, this story, is not one of quiet defeat. It is a story of strength, of betrayal uncovered, of revenge not born of cruelty, but of justice. And as Act 1 of my life's battle closed, I knew one thing with certainty. The woman they believed could be broken was about to show them the power of being unbroken. Betrayal is never a sudden blade. It is a slow tightening of the rope, each knot pulling until you can no longer breathe. And yet, when the moment comes, when the final knot is tied, the pain is just as sharp as any dagger. I began to see it more clearly in the months that followed. The whispers I had once ignored became bolder. The dismissals grew sharper. My son's eyes, once so full of trust, now darted away from mine as though I were a burden he could no longer carry. It started with the finances. I had saved over the years, carefully putting aside what little I could from every paycheck, every sacrifice. That money was meant for my later years, a cushion so I would never be a weight upon my child. But one day, my son came to me, his voice hesitant, his wife's presence looming just behind him. "Mom," he said, not meeting my gaze, "we need a little help, just until things get better. It would mean a lot if you could lend us some of your savings." The word lend carried a promise, but the shadow in his wife's eyes told me otherwise. Still, I agreed. A mother's instinct is to give, to protect, even when the request feels like a stone pressed against the chest. I withdrew a portion of my savings, pressed it into his hands, and whispered, "This is for you, for your future. But remember, son, money can be replaced. Trust cannot." He nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and left. She followed, her smile sharp, triumphant. And in that moment, I knew It was not his idea, it was hers. Weeks turned into months, and the requests multiplied, small at first, then larger, until one day I opened my account and realized most of what I had built over decades was gone. My son did not notice the way my hand shook when I signed the final check, or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore it. The betrayal was no longer a whisper. It was a storm breaking over me, but money was not the only theft. No, they wanted more. One evening, I overheard them again, their voices sharper this time. "She doesn't belong here forever," she said coldly. "This is our house now. We should make decisions without her shadow in every corner." My son's silence was heavier than any words. Then came his voice, low and uncertain. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time." She thought about other arrangements, other arrangements. Those two words echoed in my mind, louder than any shout. After all the years of sacrifice, after every night of hunger I endured so he could eat, after every blister, every wound, every moment of labor spent shaping his future, he was considering ways to cast me aside like a discarded garment. That night, I lay awake, the ceiling above me spinning. I thought of the tiny hands that once clung to mine, the boy who once cried for me in the night, the man I believed would never abandon me. Where had he gone? When had he been replaced by this stranger whose loyalty bent not to his mother, but to the whispers of his wife? Do not mistake me. This is not jealousy speaking. I never begrudged her place in his heart. I only asked for mine to remain. But betrayal is not about losing love. It is about being erased. I began to notice the way she corrected me in front of him, the way she rearranged the home, pushing my belongings into corners, as though trying to erase every trace of my presence. My chair, where I had sat for years, was moved to the far wall. My photographs, once displayed with pride, disappeared into drawers. And my son said nothing. Perhaps silence is the greatest betrayal of all. One afternoon, I returned home from the store to find the locks changed. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake, that I had approached the wrong door. But no, it was my home, my key, my life, and I could not enter. I knocked, my heart pounding, and after a long moment, the door opened. She stood there, her smile cold. "Oh," she said, as though surprised, "we had the locks changed. Didn't he tell you?" I looked past her, into the home I had built, the home where I had raised my son, and there he was, standing awkwardly in the kitchen, his head bowed, unable to meet my eyes. "No," I whispered, "he didn't tell me." The door closed behind me, like the ceiling of a tomb. In that moment, something inside me shattered. But do you know what happens when glass shatters? The pieces may be broken, but they are also sharper. That was the day I stopped asking for love. That was the day I began to prepare for something else. Revenge. If the first wound of betrayal is shock, the second is humiliation. I learned that lesson in the weeks that followed. They treated me as though I were a guest, no less than a guest. A guest is welcomed, offered tea, given a chair at the table. I was tolerated, like a piece of old furniture no one wanted but hadn't yet found the courage to discard. The mornings used to be my sanctuary. I would wake early, brew my coffee, and sit by the window where the light fell just right, warming the pages of whatever book I held. But one morning, I found her already sitting there, my chair, my sunlight, my ritual. She smiled sweetly, too sweetly, and said, "Oh, I thought I'd try a new spot today. I like it, don't you?" And I knew she wasn't trying it. She was taking it day by day. She stripped away the small joys that belonged to me, my seat at the table, my evening walks with my son, the recipes I had cooked for decades suddenly declared unhealthy or old-fashioned. She carved away at my place in the world until all that was left was silence. But silence can be a dangerous thing at first. I tried to speak. "This is my home too," I reminded my son, but he would only sigh, rub the back of his neck, and say, "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder than it has to be. As though I were the one swinging the axe. The betrayal deepened, not just in words, but in deeds. I discovered they had sold some of my jewelry gifts from my late husband, tokens of a life we built together. When I confronted her, she laughed. "They were just sitting in a box," she said, tilting her head. "It's not like you wear them. Better to put them to use. Better to put them to use." I cannot describe the fury that trembled inside me, a fire that burned behind my ribs, but I bit my tongue, because sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. I began to see their plan clearly. Piece by piece, They were erasing me. They wanted me gone, not just from the house, but from my son's life. They wanted to claim it all, the home, the money, the future. And they believed I would crumble quietly, that my age would make me soft, weak, compliant. But they underestimated me. I am a woman who has weathered storms they could not even name. I have lived through hunger and loss, through the cold nights when bills could not be paid, through the aching loneliness of widowhood. I did not survive all that to be undone by their cruelty. The more they betrayed me, the stronger my resolve became. Each insult, each theft, each dismissal carved something new inside me, not weakness, but armor. One night, I overheard them again, their voices cutting through the thin walls. "She's holding us back," she said. "Imagine what we could do if she weren't here. This house, the money, it should all be ours." And then, my son's voice, softer, uncertain. "But she's my mother." Her reply was ice. "Then act like a man and choose. It's me or her." The silence that followed was worse than any answer. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, my chest rising and falling with a fury that felt alive. For the first time, I did not cry. I did not ache. I planned. Do you know what revenge tastes like at first? It is bitter, almost unbearable. But the more you hold it on your tongue, the more it changes. It becomes sharp, almost sweet, like the first sip of dark wine. I did not yet know how I would reclaim what they had stolen. But I knew this. I would not go quietly. I began to gather pieces of myself they could not touch. My memories, my wisdom, my dignity. When she mocked me, I smiled. When he avoided my eyes, I held my head high. I wrote down every detail, every withdrawal, every insult, every theft, in a small notebook I kept hidden. Not because I planned to run to them with proof, but because someday, those details would matter. Someday, I would use their own weapons against them. Betrayal may wound, but it also teaches. And I was learning. I noticed how she slipped when she was angry, how greed made her careless. I noticed how my son's guilt weighed on him, how he avoided questions, how his silence betrayed a crack in his armor. And I tucked these observations away like seeds in the soil, knowing they would bloom when the time was right. They thought they were breaking me, but they were building something else entirely. That is the irony of betrayal. It destroys love, yes, but it also awakens strength. And mine was only just beginning to rise. The true breaking point came on a gray Sunday morning, the kind where the sky hangs heavy and the air feels damp with unspoken things. I had risen early, as always, and made breakfast. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, the smells of comfort, the sense of tradition. Food has always been my language of love. I thought, perhaps today will be different. Perhaps a warm meal will soften their hearts. But, when they entered the kitchen, laughter spilling from their lips, they didn't even sit down. "We're going out," she said, brushing past the table as though it weren't there. "We don't need this. We don't need this." My son glanced at me, guilt flickering in his eyes, but he followed her without a word. The door slammed. The house was silent. I looked at the table, the plates waiting, the syrup glistening in the morning light, the food growing cold. For the first time, the ritual felt foolish, not love, not tradition, foolish. I sank into a chair and pressed my hands to my face, and in that silence, I admitted the truth. I was no longer a mother to him, not in the way that mattered. He had chosen her, fully, completely, and with that choice, I had been exiled from my own life. It would have been easier, perhaps, if they had simply ignored me, but betrayal has a way of twisting deeper. It is not satisfied with silence. It seeks humiliation. That week, I discovered the final cruelty. I had been saving letters, old notes my husband wrote me, tiny scraps of love preserved in a shoebox under my bed. They were my treasure, my anchor to a past that had meaning. But when I went to retrieve them, the box was gone. I searched the entire room, every corner, every drawer, nothing. I confronted her that evening, my voice trembling but steady enough. "My letters," I said. "Where are they?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, those old papers. They were just clutter. I threw them out." Klata. She called my husband's words, the soul of our marriage. Klata. I could feel my chest tighten, my pulse pound. I wanted to scream, to strike, to shake her, until the smugness fell from her face. But instead, I stood perfectly still. And in that stillness, something inside me shifted. It was the moment I stopped being a victim. Do you know the strange relief that comes when pain turns into clarity? It is sharp, almost blinding. Suddenly, everything made sense. They would take until nothing remained. They would strip me bare, erase me, bury me alive in my own house, if I let them. But I would not let them. I went to my room that night and sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house. Their voices rose and fell, laughter echoing faintly. My hands curled into fists, then released. Slowly, carefully, I began to plan. Revenge was no longer a bitter taste, it was purpose. I began with myself. I stopped pleading for scraps of kindness. I stopped waiting for his eyes to meet mine with love. That mother was gone. In her place was a woman who saw clearly, who understood that betrayal could only be answered with strength. I started setting aside money, small amounts, unnoticed, tucked away. I gathered documents, receipts, proof of what was mine. Every detail they had dismissed, I collected like a weapon. And most of all, I hardened my heart. Each memory of my husband's love became a shield. Each loss became fuel. The next time she mocked me, I smiled. The next time my son avoided my gaze, I looked at him with eyes that no longer begged. They did not notice the change, not yet. But the shift had begun. Betrayal had taken everything I once was, but in its ashes, it had given me something new. Resolve, strength, and a hunger for justice that would not be denied. That night, as the house grew quiet and the shadows deepened, I whispered to myself, they believe they have broken me, but they have only forged me, and soon, they will learn what it means to betray a woman who has nothing left to lose. Revenge, for me, did not arrive in fire and fury. It arrived quietly, like the steady drip of water wearing down stone. I realized early that if I struck too quickly, they would dismiss me. If I lashed out in anger, they would call me bitter, unstable, old. No, my revenge would not be a shout. It would be a whisper that grew into a storm. The first step was reclaiming control over myself. I stopped cooking elaborate meals they never ate. I stopped setting the table for 3 when I knew they would dine elsewhere. Instead, I cooked for myself simple, nourishing meals that carried no sting of rejection. I began to walk daily, head held high, through the neighborhood. People noticed. Neighbors, who once pitied me now waved, stopped to chat, and asked about my health. Slowly, I wove myself back into the fabric of the community. If my son and his wife wished to isolate me, I would not allow it. I would build connections outside their reach. Then came the second step. Information. I retrieved my hidden notebook and added to it daily, not just their insults, not just their cruelty, but patterns, bank transactions, changes in schedules, names mentioned in hurried phone calls. I documented everything, the way a historian records the fall of an empire. One afternoon, I followed her discreetly, at a distance. She believed me too timid, too frail, to notice her absence. But I noticed, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. She wasn't shopping, as she had claimed. She was meeting a man at a cafe across town. Their laughter, their intimacy, their careless touch across the table, it told me everything I needed to know. So the betrayal was not only mine, it was my son's too. He was blind, manipulated, discarded even as he clung to her. I did not weep for him that day. Instead, I wrote it down. Time, place, description. Proof. The third step was subtle resistance. I stopped making it easy for them to control me. When she tried to move my things, I moved them back. When she belittled me, I responded not with silence but with calm, cutting words. A house reveals its true owner, I told her once, my voice steady. And time always tells the truth. She laughed it off, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, a crack in her confidence. With each small act, I was reclaiming ground they believed was theirs. But revenge is not only about reclaiming, it is about turning their weapons back upon them. One evening, I found myself alone with my son. She was late returning home. I brewed tea, set the cups down, and said gently, "Are you happy, truly happy?" He hesitated, his eyes darting away. "Of course," he said too quickly. I let the silence stretch. Then, softly, "Sometimes love blinds us to truths we don't want to see, but the truth always finds its way through." His face tightened. He did not answer. But I saw the seed land. I did not press further. Seeds need silence to grow. The fourth step was patience. Revenge is a dish best served, not only cold, but prepared carefully, seasoned with time. I knew the cracks in their foundation would widen on their own. Greed always consumes itself. Betrayal always circles back. My task was to be ready when the moment came, and so I prepared. I gathered documents proving my ownership of the house. I secured my finances, moving what I could into accounts they could not touch. I even visited a lawyer, quietly, without their knowledge, to ensure that what was mine could not be stolen. Walking out of that office, papers clutched in my hand, I felt taller than I had in years. I was no longer the forgotten widow, no longer the discarded mother. I was a woman reclaiming her life, piece by piece. And with every step, my revenge sharpened. They believed me powerless. They believed my silence meant defeat. But what they did not understand was this: silence can also mean strategy. I was waiting, watching, gathering, because the day was coming when I would no longer stand in the shadows of betrayal. The day was coming when I would step into the light, armed with truth, and watch their empire crumble. And when it did, I would not raise my voice. I would only say, "This is what you built. This is what betrayal brings." The first sign that my quiet resistance was working came in her eyes. She had grown used to my silence, my compliance, the way I once lowered my head whenever her words cut sharp. But now, when I met her gaze steadily, when I answered her barbs with calm wisdom, she faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, too quick for my son to notice, but not too quick for me. I knew then that I had found her weakness, her arrogance. She believed control was permanent, that cruelty was strength. But I knew better. Strength is not loud. It does not shout or mock. True strength is steady, quiet, unshakable. So I wielded mine like a blade, hidden in plain sight. When she tried to push me from the living room, where I'd always watched my evening shows, I stayed seated. "I've watched this program for years," I said gently. "And habits, like roots, run deep. You can plant new flowers, but the roots remain." She forced a smile, but her hand twitched on the remote. My son sat silently beside her, but I noticed how he shifted uncomfortably. Another seed planted. I began weaving myself into spaces she could not erase. I baked pies for neighbors, who praised me loudly when we met in public. I attended church gatherings, where I was welcomed warmly. Slowly, a network of allies grew around me, people who saw me not as the silent woman in the background, but as someone of value, someone with dignity. And I knew she noticed, because she began to complain. "She's always talking to people." I overheard her mutter to my son one night, "She's trying to turn them against me." I smiled quietly in my room. I did not need to turn anyone against her. She was doing that all by herself. The second phase of my plan was information. I already knew of her infidelity, but I needed proof, solid proof. So, one afternoon, I followed her again, more carefully this time. I wore plain clothes, kept my distance. She believed me too frail, too invisible to be capable of such a thing, and that arrogance was her undoing. I saw her meet the same man again. This time, they were careless, holding hands openly, laughing without restraint. I pulled out the small camera I had bought weeks earlier and captured the moment. One photo, two, three, enough to silence denial, enough to shatter illusions. When I returned home, I printed them, slipping them into an envelope I locked away. My hands trembled, but not with fear, with power. It had been so long since I felt the weight of power in my grasp. The third phase was drawing out my son. I never attacked, never accused. Instead, I asked small, piercing questions. "Do you ever feel," I said one evening, as we washed dishes side by side, "that the person you love most may not love you in the same way?" He looked startled, his hand pausing on the plate he held. "Why would you say that?" I shrugged softly. "Because love is proven in actions, not words. And sometimes, actions tell a story we don't want to read." He said nothing, but I saw the unease in his eyes. Another seed. Revenge, I realized, was not about striking once. It was about erosion. Slowly, steadily, I was eroding the walls she had built between us. Cracks were forming, and through those cracks, truth would pour in. Meanwhile, I secured my defenses. My lawyer finalized documents protecting the house in my name. My finances were hidden away, unreachable. She could not touch what was mine anymore. That alone gave me freedom. The kind of freedom that makes revenge not a risk, but a certainty. And still, I waited. Patience had become my greatest ally. Then, one night, the moment I had anticipated arrived. They quarreled. Their voices carried through the walls, sharp and venomous. "You're too controlling," my son shouted. "And you're too weak," she spat back. I lay in my bed, listening, my lips pressed into a firm line. The empire they had built on betrayal was crumbling under its own weight. The next morning, she stormed into the kitchen, her eyes wild. "You've been talking to him," she accused. "You're trying to turn him against me." I looked at her calmly, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "A man's heart is not so easily turned," I said softly, unless the truth is already whispering inside it. Her face flushed with rage. For the first time, she saw me not as a victim, but as a rival. And that was exactly what I wanted. Because when arrogance sees resistance, it overreaches, and when it overreaches, it falls. I could feel the tide turning. My revenge was no longer just an idea. It was in motion, unfolding step by careful step. And soon, very soon, the reckoning would come. There comes a point in every battle where silence must end, where patience, though powerful, must give way to action. I had reached that point. I had watched long enough. I had collected enough. The cracks in their false empire were wide now, and all it needed was one strike to bring the walls tumbling down. That strike would be mine. The opportunity came on a Saturday evening. We had company, neighbors, old friends of the family, people who remembered my husband and respected the years of sacrifice that had built our home. My son and his wife, entertained with their usual polished charm, smiling as though nothing ugly lurked beneath. I sat quietly, listening, waiting. When the conversation turned to family, she laughed, placing her hand possessively on my son's arm. "We've built this life together, just the two of us," she said. "It hasn't always been easy, but we've managed just fine. Just the two of us." The words were a knife, sharp and deliberate, and for a moment, I felt the old wound sting. But then the steel inside me hardened. It was time. I rose from my chair, my voice calm but carrying. "Forgive me for interrupting," I said, "but some truths should not be left unspoken." The room quieted. All eyes turned to me. I pulled the envelope from my bag, the one I had carried for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Slowly, deliberately, I laid the photographs on the table. Gasps rippled through the room. My son's eyes widened, his face draining of color as he stared at the images. His wife, hand in hand with another man, her laughter careless, her betrayal undeniable. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, chaos. He turned to her, his voice shaking with fury. "What is this? What have you done?" she stammered, her mask cracking, words tumbling out in half denials and excuses. But the proof lay there in plain sight, undeniable, undeniable. I did not shout, I did not gloat. I simply stood tall, my voice steady as stone. Betrayal is always hidden until it is not, and when it is revealed, it destroys everything it touches. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers spreading like wildfire. My son looked broken, as though the ground had fallen away beneath him, and she looked at me with pure hatred, realizing in that moment that I was not the weak woman she believed. I had beaten her at her own game. But my revenge was not just for me, it was for him too. My son, blind and manipulated, now forced to see the truth. When the guests left, silence settled like ash. My son sat with his head in his hands. She stormed upstairs, slamming the door, her reign of control cracking apart. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I tried to warn you," I said softly. "Love cannot survive lies, and truth always finds its way." He wept, not just for her betrayal, but for the years lost, the love wasted, the blindness that had cost him dearly. And though part of me ached for him, another part stood firm. He had chosen his path, and now he faced the cost. As for me, I felt no guilt, only release. 4 months, I had carried the weight of silence, of dismissal, of erasure. Now, the balance had shifted. I was no longer invisible, no longer powerless. I had spoken truth into the light, and it had shattered the lies around me. That night, as I lay in bed, I did not cry. I did not ache. I slept deeply, peacefully, for the first time in years, because revenge, when it comes from justice, does not corrode. It cleanses. And I knew Act 3 of my story was complete. But my journey was not over. There was still one act left. The final chapter where healing and hope would rise from the ashes of betrayal. And I was ready to meet it. The house felt quieter after the storm. Quieter, but not empty. It was the silence of aftermath. The kind that lingers when truth has been spoken and cannot be taken back. For years, I had lived in this home with my son and his wife, tiptoeing through tension, silenced by their dismissal, carrying the heavy burden of knowing more than I was allowed to say. But now, the weight had shifted. The lies had been broken in the open, and there was no going back to the life we once had. I did not regret it. Betrayal cuts deep, yes, but truth heals deeper. And in my heart, I knew what had happened was necessary, not just for me, but for my son, who had to see the truth with his own eyes. The days after the revelation were painful. He withdrew into himself, moving through the house like a man haunted. He spoke little, ate less, and spent hours staring at the photographs as though they might change if he looked long enough. I understood his grief. He was mourning not only a marriage, but also the illusion he had built, the story he had believed, the loyalty he thought was unbreakable. I wanted to reach for him, to comfort him, but I knew this was a journey he had to walk alone, at least for a while. As for her, she avoided me. She slinked through the house like a wounded predator, anger flashing in her eyes whenever they met mine. She blamed me, of course, and perhaps, in her mind, she was right, but I did not carry her blame. I carried only the truth, and truth is never a burden to those who honor it. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace with my knitting, my son finally spoke. His voice was low, broken. "Mom," he said, "you knew, didn't you? You've known for a long time." I set my work aside, meeting his wary eyes. "Yes," I said gently. "I knew. Why didn't you tell me?" I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully, "Because you wouldn't have believed me. Sometimes, my son, we can only learn the truth when we are ready to face it. And you weren't ready, not then." He closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I feel like such a fool." I leaned forward, placing my hand over his. "You are not a fool. You are a man who loved, and loving is never foolish. What's foolish is betraying love. That is her sin, not yours." He gripped my hand tightly, like a boy again, and for the first time in years, I saw my son, not the man blinded by pride or manipulated by charm, but the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run through these halls with laughter in his voice. That night, I prayed for him, for strength, for healing, for the wisdom to grow from pain instead of shrinking under it, and I prayed for myself too, for the courage to keep standing tall, not with bitterness, but with grace, because revenge may end a chapter, but it does not write the whole story. The ending must be one of hope. Days turned into weeks. She left, eventually, packed her things in silence, her head held high but her eyes filled with venom. She did not say goodbye. When the door closed behind her, the house exhaled. My son stood there for a long time, staring at the empty hallway, his jaw tight. I touched his arm, but he shook his head, walking outside into the night. I did not follow. Some journeys are meant to be taken alone, but I knew he would return, and when he did, he would not be the same man. Pain reshapes us. It can hollow us out, yes, but it can also carve space for new strength, new wisdom, new beginnings. As for me, I found myself strangely lighter. The tension that had clouded the air for so long was gone. For the first time in years, I could sit in my kitchen, sip my tea, and not feel watched, judged, or dismissed. I found joy in small things again, the sound of birds in the morning, the smell of fresh bread baking, the simple rhythm of daily life. And with each passing day, I remembered something I had nearly forgotten. I was not just a mother, not just the woman they had tried to silence. I was myself, a woman with stories, with wisdom, with a life that had value beyond how others chose to see me. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to live for me again. When betrayal shatters a life, people often ask, how do you go on? How do you take the fragments of what's left and build something whole again? The answer, I've learned, is simple but never easy. You begin with yourself. For years, my life had revolved around others, my husband, my children, then my son and his wife. I had lived in service, in sacrifice, in silence, and while there is dignity in giving, there is also danger in losing yourself to it. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I was more than what I could provide. So, in those quiet weeks after the storm, I made a decision. I would not let betrayal define me. I would not let revenge consume me. I had already stood my ground, exposed the lies, and reclaimed my dignity. That chapter was finished. Now, it was time to write the next one. I started small. I opened the old cedar chest in the attic, the one filled with forgotten dreams, journals I had written in my youth, photographs from travels long ago, half-finished projects I once swore I'd return to. Dust rose around me as I lifted each memory, and with it came a spark I hadn't felt in years. One of the journals held stories I had written decades earlier, little tales of love and loss, wisdom and wonder. I smiled as I read them, surprised at the voice that sounded so much like mine but younger, braver, freer. Why had I stopped writing? Why had I silenced myself? Perhaps because life has a way of demanding all of you, until there's nothing left for your own soul. But now, with the weight lifted, I felt the call again. And so, I picked up my pen. At first, the words came slowly, like a stream finding its path after a drought. But soon, the river rushed. I poured my story onto the pages, not just the betrayal, but the strength, the survival, the wisdom carved into me by years of love and loss. It was healing, yes, but it was also more than that. It was power. Because when you tell your story, you are no longer a victim of it. You become its author. And authors hold the pen, not the pain. My son watched me with quiet curiosity during those days. He saw me sitting by the window, scribbling in notebooks, humming softly to myself. "Mom," he said one evening, "you seem different, happier." Even, I looked up from my writing, smiling. "I am," I said, "because I'm remembering who I am." He frowned slightly, as though he had never considered me beyond the roles I filled in his life: mother, caretaker, silent witness. And maybe he hadn't. Maybe he, too, had forgotten that I was once a woman with dreams and passions and a voice of my own. But now he was seeing it, and I think, in some ways, it gave him courage too. Because betrayal had not only broken me, it had broken him. And as he watched me rise from the ashes, I could see him beginning to believe that he could rise too. One morning, he joined me at the kitchen table, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. "I've been thinking," he said. "I don't want to live in the past anymore. I want to start over, build something new." I nodded, pride swelling in my chest. "That's the only way forward," I told him. "But remember, son, start with yourself. Don't build your life around someone else's approval. Build it around your truth." He studied me for a long moment. "Where did you get all this strength?" I laughed softly, shaking my head. "From surviving what tried to break me, from knowing that storms may bend the tree, but they do not uproot it. Not if the roots run deep, and mine did." The weeks grew into months, and the house slowly filled with new rhythms. There was no longer the sharpness of arguments, no longer the suffocating air of resentment. Instead, there was quiet, yes, but it was a peaceful quiet. I cooked meals not out of duty, but out of joy. I planted flowers in the garden, their colors bright against the green, symbols of life blooming again after winter. And each evening, I wrote not just for myself but for the women like me, women who had given, endured, suffered, and risen again, women who had been silenced but still carried songs in their hearts. Because I realized something important. Betrayal is not the end of a story. It is only the beginning of a new one, if you choose it to be. And revenge, though it feels sweet in the moment, is not the true victory. The true victory is rebuilding yourself so completely that nothing and no one can ever break you the same way again. One night, as I sat by the fire, pen in hand, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for the strength that grew from it, for the reminder that even in my 50s, even after loss, even after heartbreak, I was not finished. I was still becoming. And that is the greatest revenge of all: to live, to thrive, to shine in the face of those who thought they had extinguished your light. The seasons changed. Spring stretched into summer, and with it came warmth, light, and a sense of renewal that mirrored the changes inside me. The betrayal was still part of my story, yes, but it was no longer the centerpiece. It was the shadow that proved there was light, the wound that showed where healing had begun. My son, too, was finding his footing again. He had taken a new job in the city, something that challenged him and gave him purpose. I watched him leave each morning with determination in his step, and I knew he was moving forward. He still carried regret, of course. How could he not? He had been blind, and blindness had cost him dearly. But regret, when handled with honesty, can be a teacher, and I could see him learning every day. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and rose, he joined me on the porch. We sat together in silence, sipping tea, until he finally spoke. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you for not giving up on me, for standing strong when I was too weak to see the truth." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. That's what mothers do. We hold the line until our children are ready to stand on their own. Tears filled his eyes, and for a moment, he was that little boy again, the one who used to run to me after a fall, seeking comfort. But now he was a man who had stumbled, fallen, and risen again, and I was proud of him. As for me, I had embraced a new rhythm of life, My days were no longer defined by waiting for scraps of kindness or dodging cold dismissals. They were filled with purpose, with creativity, with the joy of rediscovering myself. I shared my writings with a few close friends, and their responses surprised me. "Your words speak to my soul," one said. "It's like you've told my story too," said another. And that was when I realized my pain was not just my own. My survival was not just my victory. It belonged to every woman who had ever been betrayed, dismissed, or underestimated. So I kept writing, not as a way of dwelling on the past, but as a way of lighting the path for others, because there is power in saying, "This happened to me." But it did not end me. One Sunday morning, I dressed in my favorite dress, a simple blue cotton one that made me feel both comfortable and strong. I looked in the mirror and saw not the lines of age, not the scars of betrayal, but the face of a woman who had lived, endured, and risen. I smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile born not of duty, not of performance, but of genuine peace. Later that day, I attended a gathering at the community center. It was a simple event, just women sharing tea and conversation. But as I sat among them, I listened to their stories, stories of lost loves, broken families, struggles that mirrored my own. And I felt connected not by our pain, but by our resilience. When it was my turn to speak, I told them my truth. I told them about betrayal, about heartbreak, about the nights when I thought I might break. And then I told them about strength, about finding my voice again, about the victory of simply standing tall. The room was quiet as I spoke, some women nodding, others wiping tears, and in that silence, I felt something powerful, the weight of shared understanding, the bond of women who knew too well what it meant to suffer and to rise. When I finished, one woman reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave me hope." And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all now. When I sit by the window with my pen, I don't just write for myself. I write for every woman listening to this story. For you, who may be carrying your own betrayal. For you, who may feel silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. For you, who wonder if it's too late to begin again. Let me tell you this. It is never too late. Your story is not over. You are not finished. And the greatest revenge you can ever take against betrayal, against those who try to break you, is this: to live fully, to thrive boldly, and to never let their cruelty define your worth. I know this because I am living proof. I am a woman betrayed, yes, but more importantly, I am a woman reborn, and so are you. As the fire crackles beside me tonight, I leave you with this thought: do not fear the shadows of your story. They only prove that there is light ahead. Walk toward it, claim it, live it, because your story, like mine, is far from over.